Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. You know, the global problem with banks and finance and markets, it's not just a short-term phenomenon. This problem goes back 200 years or more. Because back in the old days of the Enlightenment, when Adam Smith was writing Wealth of Nations, he failed to include the limitations of the ecology. Flash forward to today, and we've got some massive problems. Because nobody costed the ecology along the way, the ecology is costing itself for us. Let's get more. Stacy Herbert, welcome back.
Yes, Max, and along this line of the deflationary collapse, everybody's talking about Tier 1 capital, Tier 2 capital, tier requirements, capital requirements, and liquidity. But there is one that is Tier 0. It's Tier Terra, you might want to call it, and that is Muscovites flee worst heat in 1,000 years. Death rate doubles. Alexander Frolov, head of Russia's Federal Weather Service, says in 1,000 years, neither we nor our ancestors have observed or recorded anything like this sort of heat. And as a result of 30% of agricultural lands burning down, of course, Russia has had to suspend exports of all wheat.
Tier Terra capital.
That's correct.
That's a good phrase. I like that. In other words, this is what the economy is trying to deal with now. Because nobody costed the true cost of air, water, soil, the things that were just taken for granted for hundreds of years, suddenly they're running out for the same reason. Actually, it's kind of funny because you can use the phrase liquidity to mean the same kind of in both realms. In the financial markets, you have peak credit or a credit collapse because there's no liquidity. And now in the global ecosystem or ecology, you have these fires breaking out all over the world and flooding and other ecological problems because there is a lack of liquidity as things dry out, causing all kinds of ecological dislocations.
Yes, because, of course, the entire global financial system is based on contracts. But all contracts are absolved with force majeure. And that's in the headline, Traders in Asia Consider Force Majeure on Russia Wheat. So this is the Terra Capital always has the final say. It always gets first claims on any sort of capital left standing.
Yes, there is a little-known bank on Wall Street called Force Majeure. It's Mother Nature's bank, and it's calling in the loans, billions, trillions, hundreds of trillions in loans, and the Earth can't pay those loans. And the result is catastrophic eco-failure, in this case, ecological failure.
In China, there's been tens of billions of dollars of damage so far this year from floods. And that takes us to this headline, Beijing billionaire who grew up with Mao sees no housing bubble. Which just seems like a perfect headline for a global communist financial system of Ponzi schemes.
Yeah, well, there clearly is a huge bubble in Chinese real estate. And the fact that nobody can see it, it always is like this at the top of a bubble. Nobody saw the top of the dot-com bubble or the mortgage bubble. They believe their own reflection in the equity mirror. It's a form of financial narcissism.
Yes, well, this woman, Zhang Xin, and she's worth $2.2 billion, says, I don't see any bubbles. The next few months will be a fantastic time to buy. So as Tier Terra capital is collapsing all around her, and the government has lent out $1.4 trillion in the last year. It's going into this misallocation of capital into crazy Ponzi schemes.
Right. It's the government buying from itself. Just like in the United States, people say, who's buying all these U.S. government treasury bonds? Well, it's the U.S. government that's buying all the U.S. government treasury bonds to keep interest rates at below 0.5% as a way to perpetuate this enormous pyramid scheme or Ponzi scheme that's now met its ultimate match, Force Majeure, the new bank on Wall Street that's eating everybody's lunch, including Milton Friedman.
You speak of these very low interest rates, and that brings me to the fact that banks are just basically coining money because they're borrowing from us, the taxpayer, at less than 1%, and then loaning it back to us, the taxpayer, at 3, 4, 5%. City bonuses jump 25% to £10 billion. This is in the UK, and city bonuses are up 25%. But I really think this is kind of a distraction where the big debate becomes about how much bonus they should collect, not how much time they should be doing.
In jail.
In jail.
Yeah. As we had said recently, they need a jail out, not a bailout.
That's correct.
And these bonuses, of course, are fabricated. They're not earning money. They don't earn in the classical sense of putting in work and hours to collect remuneration. No. It's like Argentina circa 2000, 2001. It's the kleptocracy stealing as much as they possibly can before they run as fast as they can.
And of course, we talked about this jail out and how much time bankers should be doing. And we're having all sorts of investigations. 3 years later, nobody has found a single criminal other than Bernie Madoff. This next headline, however, future crimes can be predicted perfectly, scientists say. Scientists say that they have created a new protocol which can determine to 100% accuracy if somebody's going to commit a terrorist act.
Well, that's absurd because anybody who thinks that they can predict future events fails to consider the feedback mechanism that is in play when the information that you're acting on feeds back into the present. It's the Mandelbrot set, if you will, and it's at the root of why markets are unpredictable. And you talk about it in terms of reflexivity coming out of the mouth of guys like George Soros.
But going back to this story, Max, their 100% perfect accuracy in reading minds of make-believe terrorists is just reading guilt. And we have covered this Wall Street Journal article, which covered a Harvard scientific review, that the best bankers are brain-damaged bankers. They make the most profits for any bank. So banks will tend to hire brain-damaged bankers. And how are they brain damaged? They have no empathy, no guilt. And this is what this algorithm, this protocol from these scientists is measuring your sense of guilt. Financial terrorists will continue to get away once we move to this protocol, which targets and finds guilty people.
Right. If you can identify the folks out there who lack empathy, who are, by definition, antisocial, then you know that they would make good employees at Goldman Sachs, because empathy is the enemy of performance on Wall Street. If you think about what you're doing in terms of consequences for the community at large, you wouldn't do the types of things you need to do to keep feeding that Christmas bonus.
Well, speaking of Christmas bonuses, we're moving on to crash of 2015. Won't wait for regulators to rein in Wall Street. So this is a headline playing on the notion that Jamie Dimon, remember when he was speaking to Congress, he told the story of his daughter asking what had happened, what is the financial crisis? And he told his daughter, well, financial collapse is something that happens every 5 or 7 years.
No.
So we're due for another one in 2015.
Right.
However, the new regulations being introduced by Basel III Accords, they're now totally watered down. They're allowing leverage of 33 to 1, which is where Lehman Brothers was when it collapsed. And in fact, these rules are not being brought in until 2018.
Yes, obviously, the way to stop fraud would be to make the banks increase their reserves. But they don't want that to happen because then it would jeopardize the model of reserveless banking. When every time the U.S., the quantitative easing, for example, Ben Bernanke is talking about, that is to say, somehow creating more, quote-unquote, money to ease the economy, there's no reserve backing it up. So he's just putting in more debt. He's actually exacerbating the problem. He's trying to solve the debt problem by creating more debt. He's like the Norman Bates of bankers. Remember Psycho, when Norman Bates was in front of the mirror and he dressed up as his mother and he was trying to kill himself. That's Ben Bernanke in front of the economy. He's trying to kill the deflation by stabbing himself.
Timothy Geithner is quoted in this article speaking last week at NYU, and he said that delaying the capital rules will make it easier for banks to earn money they use as capital. The article calls it regulatory forbearance, which is akin to allowing drivers to build up speed before buckling the seatbelt.
Yeah, or it's like saying people who rob liquor stores would do better if liquor stores put less onerous padlocks on the front door. That's true. If they took away the locks on the front door of the liquor store thieves would make more money. Wall Street banking thieves are going to make more money if you reduce the hurdle one has to jump to borrow money to speculate and then every time they make a bad speculation, they go back and get more free money.
This brings me to a video, and this is from March 2009, also at NYU Stern School of Business, and it's Jamie Dimon speaking to the group of collected students there.
How many of you, either representing yourselves or an institution or a corporation or a university, took money and moved it from something more aggressive to less aggressive or to something more conservative? Raise your hands real quick. Okay, so when people say what caused the crisis, you did. And I'm being completely honest about it. Individuals acting wisely, and we were all acting wisely, this wasn't malfeasance, said, I want to be more careful.
So when we wake up in, 2015, all panicked about the next crisis, it's going to be our fault because Jamie Dimon has predicted the future, and he says you're going to be the ones that cause the crisis by withdrawing from our banking system.
Well, this guy, who's going to stop this guy? Lloyd Blankfein, Jamie Dimon. I mean, they're the Al Capone, and I mean, they're reprehensible.
Well, you bring up the question, who's going to stop these guys? This takes me to a video interview with Janet Tavakoli on First Business, and she's asked this about the Financial Crisis Inquiry Committee, and she says that they're basically covering up for the likes of Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein at Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan.
Why aren't we investigating the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission? Is Congress just covering up for all of these officers and basically putting the minimum amount of information to do the minimum amount of disclosure into these reports? It's a sham. Mm-hmm. It's a scandal.
Oh, it is a sham. It is a scandal. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Now, when we come back, I'm going to be talking with William K. Black, the guy who cleaned up the S&L industry in the 80s. How come he's not cleaning up this mess? Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. A lot of people are scratching their head. What do we do? These banks. What's going on? Should we appoint a special commission? Is there anyone who knows what's going on? Well, fortunately, there is somebody in America that does know what's going on, who's faced the problems before, and who has solved the problems before. Welcome to the show. Let's go to Missouri to talk with Professor William K. Black. Professor Black, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
All righty. Now, just to remind people, of course, you were a bank regulator back in the 1980s when I was working on Wall Street, and you cleaned up the S&L crisis, and you put 1,000 bankers away in jail, at least. I may have the number wrong. First, Professor Black, whatever happened to Sarbanes-Oxley? Why are we discussing how much bonuses these bankers should be getting instead of discussing how much time in jail they should be serving?
Sarbanes-Oxley had next to nothing to do with creating successful criminal prosecutions. It got focused on procedure, and ironically, it made a fortune for the Big Four audit firms that were the heart of the problem.
Talk about the racketeering here, because you've got the accounting agencies, the rating agencies, the investment banks, the hedge funds. They're all operating as a racket. Isn't that correct?
All of them have been deliberately subjected to what we in economics call a Gresham's dynamic. In a Gresham's dynamic, the least ethical gain a competitive advantage. And when that happens, marketplaces become perverse, and they drive the ethical out of the marketplace, and the people that triumph are the absolute worst folks. Now, this is deliberately engineered. For example, WAMU, it has come out, had a blacklist of appraisers, except you got on the blacklist of appraisers if you were honest.
Right. So the least ethically inclined have an advantage in this new economy. Now, if you look at what happened, let's say Argentina, circa 2000, 2001, there was wholesale looting by the elites. They stole the money and they ran away. When I hear about these Christmas bonuses on Wall Street, it seems to me that basically it's wholesale looting. It's not reform. It's not stimulus. It's not anything other than looting. Would you argue with that conclusion?
Well, to tie your questions together, Sarbanes-Oxley didn't work because it didn't deal with the fundamental perverse incentives. And the fundamental perverse incentives are the ones we've just been discussing. One is executive compensation, but the other is professional compensation. And that's what allows the CEO crooks in the financial industry to suborn all of these entities that are supposed to be independent, that are supposed to be controls, and turn them into the most valuable allies of the underlying accounting fraud, which is designed to maximize CEO and CFO bonuses. And this is why I say American business schools all too often have become fraud factories.
Okay, well, what you're describing there can also be used to describe how a mafia family works. They co-opt other people in the society to do their bidding for them, and you have a mafia-style hierarchy. But during the 1980s, of course, Rudy Giuliani went after Drexel using RICO, anti-racketeering laws, if I remember correctly. Now, why can't they bring that back? This is obviously racketeering. Why are they pussyfooting, and why don't they go after the racket as a whole?
The fundamental reason is that the FBI and the Justice Department can only be successful if the regulators serve as the Sherpas. And I mean that in the following two senses. We as the regulators have to be the guide, but we also have to do the heavy lifting, because we're the only ones that have the resources and the expertise in the industry to be able to make an FBI investigation successful. The Huffington Post had a superb story on this that actually I helped generate, and that they finally got the regulators to answer the question, how many criminal referrals have you done this decade? And the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is supposed to regulate national banks, and the Office of Thrift Supervision, which was supposed to regulate savings and loans, the answer was 0. We made well over 1,000 criminal referrals. If you don't investigate, you don't find.
Okay, William K. Black, during the S&L crisis of the 80s, how big was your staff?
My staff was 50 attorneys.
Okay, how big is the staff right now going after the problem?
The Justice Department has roughly 1/5 the staff that the Justice Department used against the savings and loan crisis, and this crisis is somewhere on the order of 40 times larger than the savings and loan crisis. Okay,
that 40 times larger. Now, the savings and loan crisis, in nominal terms or inflation-adjusted terms, it was something on the order of $600 billion?
Now, it's less than that. I can give you the figure in 1993 dollars. It was roughly $150 billion.
So you're talking about a 40 times bigger. Help me with the math here. So you're saying that we're talking about an amount of...
We're talking about losses in the 6 to 10 to 15 trillion range, depending on who you believe.
Okay, now you say 6 to 10 to 15 trillion. That's interesting, because in an economy like the one in America, Walmart can tell you who's buying a razor on a Thursday at 2:30 in the afternoon with an RFID tracking system and advanced supply chain management and all kinds of interesting technological innovations. But apparently, we don't know whether we're losing 6, 10, or 15 trillion dollars out of the back door of the banking system. Don't you see a bit of a disconnect there?
Yes, exactly. That's what we've been emphasizing, the death of regulation. So what happened in this crisis compared to the savings and loan crisis is there's a cover-up in this crisis. And if you are deliberately change the accounting rules, which was done, and if the regulators deliberately don't look hard, run these sham stress tests, then you don't find remotely the true extent of the losses. And if you don't investigate, you don't find the losses and you don't find the fraud. Therefore, the quality of information that we have in this crisis is vastly worse. Now remember, we had over 1,000 successful felony prosecutions. We had several thousand successful enforcement actions, and we had roughly 1,000 successful civil actions. Think how many facts come out in the course of all of those investigations that give you an incredibly accurate picture of what happened. None of that has happened. Name a really large civil suit by the government against any of the parties that specialized in the non-prime lending. Name a huge enforcement action that actually went to some kind of hearing and information was made public. It hasn't happened.
Let me ask you something. You're saying $10 trillion, to use a round number, in losses. The Federal Reserve and Barack Obama have thrown quantitative easing and stimulus packages at these losses to try to get the economy starting again, but the economy is rolling over and playing dead again, which is to infer that there are more losses yet to be disclosed. Now, William K. Black, I know that's a bit of a guessing game because no one's providing accurate information, but what is yet to be revealed in this debt vortex? Is it another $10 trillion yet to be revealed in debt?
Well, there are two different things going on. First, there is a really severe recession, and that really severe recession has reduced private demand somewhere in the range of $6 trillion. The stimulus bill is, of course, roughly $800 billion. So you can see that it isn't remotely going to fill the hole in lost demand, and you actually have to net out of the stimulus bill a $200 billion reduction in state and local funding. Now, there's a second thing. How big are the losses? The IMF and the administration originally estimated the losses in the $2 to $2.5 trillion range, and we know that the recession and the loss in housing values turned out to be far worse than the initial estimates, right? And you can see what losses are being recognized by the banks, and it's nowhere near that, and we know why. Because the banks used their political pull to get Congress to extort the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, to change the accounting rules so the banks don't have to recognize the losses unless and until they actually sell the assets. So what happened? While there has been a massive increase in delinquencies, there's an enormous lag in foreclosures. And even when there's foreclosures, there's an enormous lag in selling the assets. This is the Japanese strategy of covering up the losses, and it prevents markets from recovering. That's why Japan had the lost decade, which is really 2 lost decades.
So you're saying on the demand side, we know there's been a drop in demand, and on the missing the black hole of debt, we know it's been understated. We know that they haven't marked to market the value of this debt. It's still sitting there on the balance sheet, yet to be marked to market at some point. The theory in the Fed and the Treasury is to somehow paper over this problem, extend and pretend, and to get some Hail Mary pass, something is going to come along to do what you decided you needed to do in the S&L crisis. You ring-fenced all that debt. Here, they've done none of that ring-fencing. So all the crooks, they're still in place. How come no one has ring-fenced the crooks?
I know you think you're a pessimist, but you're actually an optimist. It's actually worse. The reason you gimmick the accounting rules is so that these guys can still pay their bonuses to themselves.
Right. So this was a big lesson from the savings and loan crisis, was not to act more ethically, but how do we change the law so that next time we do the same fraud, we won't get caught? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, worse than that again, because after the savings and loan crisis, we passed the Prompt Corrective Action Law, which mandates the closure of these insolvent banks. But it has what we told them as a huge Achilles heel. And that is, if you gimmick the accounting rules, you can gimmick the Prompt Corrective Action Law. And that's what's happened. That's the Japanese strategy of covering up. We sold bad assets promptly, and that allowed markets to recover and what we call clear. If you keep a huge overhang of inventory that everybody knows is out there, then markets don't recover.
All right, finally, one last question. What about the possibility of citizen arrests? Is this a viable possibility?
No. But citizens can demand that these folks act against the major frauds. They can demand that they clean up the accounting. That's just a complete obscenity to be able to gimmick the accounting so that you continue to pay yourself massive bonuses for destroying major financial institutions. Citizens can demand an end to the systemically dangerous institutions. These are the SDIs, roughly 20 of them. The Treasury says if a single one of them goes, they will cause a global crisis. We know there are absolutely no economies of scale at that size. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're far less efficient because they're so gargantuan. We know that their political power causes immense problems, and we know that they are a ticking time bomb for the world economy. So the citizens can demand that those SDIs, the systemically dangerous institutions, be shrunk to the point that they no longer threaten a global crisis.
All right, that's all the time for we have this time. William K. Black, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacy Herbert and William K. Black, down there in Kansas City, Missouri. And if you want to send me an email, please do so at Keiser Report at, what is it at? Oh, yeah, rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.